Hello and welcome to the ActiveState podcast. My name is Shane Warden. I'm Director of Engineering at ActiveState.
And I'm Evan Smith. I'm Director of Product here at ActiveState. This is podcast number 2, Tech Debt or Security, What Makes You Migrate? Shane, so you're got the job title I more or less associate with deciding when we migrate. Between those two, let's start with how would you define tech debt and what do you kind of think of as security?
Oh, those are great questions. Let's start with security, which is really a balance between how do I know that nobody can do anything I don't intend to do with our systems? And how do I make sure the people I want to do things can do the things they want? So there's that tension and balance there. I think that's important to keep this in mind. How do I define tech debt? That's tricky because it's kind of a controversial thing. If you look at when tech debt was originally described, I think by Ward Cunningham on the old Portland Pattern Repository Wiki, the C2 Wiki, he was really talking about any shortcuts we make in the business requirements to get a product out the door sooner. And by out the door, I mean, we've got 2 weeks or one sprint or 1 week. We want to show a demo to our customer. What shortcuts can we take? What pieces do we not have to address? What edge cases can we ignore just to make sure that we can put this code in front of people so they can use it quickly? That was the original intent of tech debt, a very focused investment. I think these days, 20, 25 years later, a lot of people see tech debt as anything in the system that I would do differently now. And this is not a bad thing. It's just a different thing. But I think it's important to keep in mind the distinction between stuff I would change if I were to change everything now, if I were to start over now, from stuff where we deliberately took shortcuts in addressing what users want in order to get something to them sooner. So if we set those up in mind, that's how I personally define tech debt. That's how I personally define security. Does that resonate at all with you, Ev?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about you mentioned the definition of tech debt has kind of shifted over time. And what's interesting about the new definition is it's subjective. Oh, I would have done that differently. Well, I don't know anyone who does everything right the first time. And I hope we're all kind of learning to be better. So every time you do something, by the time you're done, you should look at it and go, ah, I could have done that better if I
Right.
just had more time. So does that kind of imply that everything we do is naturally turning to tech debt? Or do you feel like, oh no, is there a definition of the work that doesn't just automatically become tech debt? Are we ever doing anything that's good enough?
Probably. I mean, if you look at some of the work like NASA has done or things like that, where like the documentary, like They Write the Right Stuff. If you know, for example, you're going to send a probe into space and you have nobody out there who can swap parts, if you've got cosmic rays coming in and things like that, you know that you have a launch window of this week, and otherwise you're going to miss this and you're going to orbit maybe something, hopefully, for years before you get where you want. You know all these constraints up front, and you can design and implement your systems to those constraints and realize that those aren't going to change because you are not going to change orbital mechanics. Most of the projects we do aren't like that. Some of the products we're building at ActiveState right now are like, we think our customers are going to like this, but we're going to take something and put it in front of them and say, how does this fit with you and what you want to do? We're going to get feedback from them and come back and improve these things. So we have a deliberate agile process of saying we're not going to overinvest in building something we think people are going to want. It's more important that we are able to get feedback from them, hands-on use of an actual project, an actual user experience, and then we'll change how we think about building the next phase. So we are deliberately, I think, taking on some of that original Cunningham definition of tech debt, saying we think these things might be wrong, or we're willing to accept being wrong because it helps us move more quickly. It helps us not over invest in things that turn out to be, at best, the wrong activities, and at worst, potentially useless or actually harmful. So yeah,
Right.
I think we naturally generate this type of technical debt just as a matter of process.
And you mentioned something important there. So the customer might see this in a completely different way. So from the artist, the coder, the person actually writing the program, they see, oh, I could have done that better. The customer doesn't see the same thing, right? Like they see,
Right.
if anything, they experience it as slowness or, oh, that's odd. But rarely do they go, oh, this thing's full of tech debt. Like any
Right.
product, I don't think anyone looks at a car and goes, oh, this is full of tech debt. They go, oh, this is complicated. Oh, this doesn't work very well. Oh, this is slow. So that's
Right.
part of just on my side of things where I see it is not, oh, this we could have done this better, because I think everyone as a developer should be naturally feeling that way about their work if they're getting better. It's a question
Right.
of, oh, when does this actually impact customers, and how do we make those decisions of, okay, well, we've got this thing that we know we could have done better and we're always feeling that way, but what's the time to actually resolve these things? What are the important things to resolve as far as technical debt goes? I think that's really a bit of the balance here. And just coming back to the central question of when is it time to migrate? I think if you ask a person as soon as they're done, oh, can I have done this better? Is that time to migrate? Probably not. And once it starts impacting customers, once you see performance issues, that's the time to migrate? Maybe. And like, where do we draw that line? Because everyone thinks things could be faster in a perfect world. It's when does the impact felt? When does it impact, sales and things like that, the actual important things with what we do? Kind of becomes a question of tech debt there.
And we think we can make this more concrete, right? I mean, I could probably upset a lot of people by saying the formatting of your code doesn't matter. I don't believe that, but I could be polemic and say that. But I think it's more useful to say there is duplication in this system. The customer doesn't notice that. These variables are named the wrong thing. The customer doesn't notice that. This code might be difficult to modify or difficult to test. The customer doesn't notice that until the customer does, when it affects the quality of the software, the reliability, the performance, things like that. But those are things we can measure in a way that is less subjective than I'm looking at this code and I feel nervous trying to edit it because I feel like it's fragile, or I wouldn't have written this way, or I think there's duplication here. And so it's important to me, at least, when I'm thinking about how to address all of these problems in an engineering team, be able to say it's worth investing time and effort fixing these problems. These problems, they're not worth investing in right now compared to the other, right? Because I know as an engineer myself, I would love to have all the time and effort and ability in the world to make everything polished and perfect for whatever subjective means that is. But what I thought was perfect when I started, it might not be perfect when I get done. And that may not change how the users of the software perceive it or how it meets their needs or how it produces business value there. So that to me is an
Mhm.
important distinction to be able to make.
Yeah, and the phrase that gets used a lot is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think
Right.
as people who are interested in doing better or writing better code, like ain't broke is a pretty broad category, right? There's stuff that
It's
works that
entirely
goes, oh
subjective.
man, it can work while it's on fire and it's working, and people don't see it as long as it's under the covers. So when do you think it's time to actually change things over, when you've accumulated enough tech debt? Like, or what are kind of the things you look for in a project or a thing, or you're reopening it, you've inherited something? What are the signs that you go, oh, it's time to do something significant about this?
To me, it's all about change and the cost of change. So for example, if I remember this from like the year 2000, there was an old Windows 3.1, not 3.11, but 3.1 computer that was running an oscilloscope in a lab. And at some point, that computer is going to stop working. Capacitor is going to blow. We're going to have to replace the motherboard. That oscilloscope is going to be down because that processor, that machine is going to reach the end of its hardware life. There is a point in time where we're going to have to make a hard decision, or that decision is going to be made for us. We need to replace this. So there is, I think, a natural endpoint to software and systems we need to keep in mind. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is really along the lines of, it ain't broke, don't fix it. If I don't need to modify something, it doesn't really matter if it's hard to modify. It only matters when I need to modify it. If I'm worried about this particular piece of code, this particular function, this particular object, this particular library changing out from under me, or being fragile, or not working very well, when someone goes in and makes a change, it always has bugs elsewhere. If we never touch that, it's not ideal, but it is a trade-off we should consider making, because if it is working and stable, at least for what it's doing, until someone modifies it, we can put off modifying until it's necessary. But again, that choice may be made for us. Similarly, you might say that we're using CentOS 6 and it's been working fine for us. That has an end date on it. Python 2.7 has an end date on it, and it's going to get more and more expensive, more and more difficult to move away from that, because there are going to be fewer and fewer people. There's less and less support for keeping that thing up and running. So sometimes we can get out of that, sometimes we can't. My personal preference is to say anything that we can delay because it's not the most important thing, we should delay. I don't want to modify things just because they're old. I want to modify things because we've got a plan to migrate away from them, which is probably answering the question with the question, how do you decide what your migration strategy looks like?
Right. And I think the way we kind of see that cascade, because it's a perfectly rational choice at the time, right?
Yeah, these
And
are all
then you
perfectly
go,
rational choices. I think we should assume that. We should assume
yeah.
good faith.
And then as kind of time goes on, you go, okay, well, let's prop this up again. Let's not look at this. Let's build another thing we could have done better around this to kind of keep it going. And then eventually you've got this structure that's made out of one-off decisions and rational choices that's suddenly very hard to
Right.
break in. You kind of mentioned the issue of the difficulty isn't the upgrade. The difficulty is like actually making a change with systems that are complicated. And the more
Right.
layers you add onto it, all of a sudden you've got this armored onion of things that you have to get through just to do an upgrade. And you go, well, it'd be easier just to tack another layer onto this than it would be to upgrade. But I think this is the point where there's a certain anxiety that starts to grow. And oh, we should have done something about that 10 years ago. Well, why didn't we? And then if you went back in a time machine, you'd be, oh, there's tons of other priorities not fixing this thing. And then 10 years later, here we are. And that's where I find people generally get to. It's never anyone goes, oh, I want to stay on the oldest thing forever. It's just they find
Right.
themselves there
Right.
eventually and they realized, oh, we've reached this breaking point. It's very hard to isolate because it's not one big decision or one big event. It's suddenly, oh, that's too old. We can't do anything about it anymore. And all the things we've done, the guy who knew how to tweak this is retired. There's usually some other event that brings up
The
to
choice
the
is made
forefront,
for
right?
you. Yes.
Yeah. So it's either retirement of the hardware. You kind of mentioned some of the older stuff, 2.7, CentOS. Sometimes it's, oh, this is the last guy at the company who had to do this and you're relying on him and he's,
Right.
won the lottery and gone off to the Bahamas. Now what do we do? So if I, that the generally the choice is kind of made for you. I think there's very few companies who have the luxury of being very proactive about this, often because, oh, the system works for profiting off it. Don't look at it too hard. So in those cases, it's the situation that the choice gets made for you. And I think it's similar, but a little different in the security space, right? Because sometimes
Mhm.
it's an outside influence again, but sort of an external factor rather than, oh no, this thing has failed. It's, oh, there's a problem. Oh, there's a problem that's super significant. How do you kind of see those things manifest when a security issue pushes you to make a change? And we've
Yeah.
already talked about it. It's the same sort of systems, right? Like it doesn't make it any easier when there's a security issue. It's just a layer on top.
And I think it's also unpredictable, right? I think one of the more difficult pieces of security is you might be running this piece of software and it has a vulnerability. That vulnerability was there since you deployed it. It's only after someone has discovered it or someone has exploited it that you realize we were not safe all along. So that decision gets made for you there. And it's not necessarily the case that keeping up to date always protects you from that. To me, the question is really how long does it take me after discovery of a thing to make sure that I am no longer vulnerable? Some of that is going to be your other security practices. If you're practicing defense in depth, for example, if you're practicing good monitoring and auditing and logging and things like that, you have much, much better capabilities to react to something untoward like that. But part of it is just going to have to be you need to acknowledge there are going to be forces outside of your control you are going to have to react to. And your ability to react to those as quickly as possible, as is reasonable, is going to be your ability to protect yourself, I think, in those cases.
And which of so tech debt versus security, which do you find kind of carries the bigger stick as far as motivating people to make those changes? Because often tech debt comes
Mhm.
from an internal, okay, now it's finally time. And security often comes from an outside influence, or even, oh, a new VP started and he's got a security mandate. It's time to make these
Right.
changes. Which do you find one gets the company under more momentum to make a change, or do you find they're sort of like equally weighted?
That's a great question. I mean, you could say legitimately that they are both existential risks to a company. This potentiometer, not this potentiometer, I'm sorry, we'll edit that out. This oscilloscope hardware goes down, all of a sudden we can't do verification in our lab. That could cost us millions of dollars if you got a tape out coming up, for example. Whereas if something like Heartbleed or Log4j or Shell4j comes out, you're going to spend how much time, how many days wandering around all your systems trying to find, do we use this? Where do we use it? How can we get rid of it? What's our migration plan? Right? You have all these potential outside external shocks to your system that could come up. What is your capacity to react to those and absorb those into your schedule and your resources and your planning? With that all said, even though they're both existential risks, I think security probably has the more visibility And so, just in terms of are more people going to ask you about it, that's probably the case. I haven't seen a lot of security questionnaires that say, are you using CentOS 6? Are you using Python 2.7? Are you using Perl 5.8? I have seen a lot of security questionnaires that say, do you keep your systems patched? Do you keep your systems up to date? Have you did internal penetration testing? Do you have disaster recovery procedures and things like that? That may be the case that you find bugs where you shine the flashlight in the dark. I suspect it might be, but we should deal with the world as it is. That's where people are shining the flashlight in the dark right now, probably more on security than they are on technical debt, on aging systems, on delayed migrations.
Right. So I think you're saying it's more of a process of how do you stay on top of these things? Like one of the factors is going to boil over. Some of them carry a little bit more weight than the others, but
Right.
and I guess that leads me to like, how do you stay on top of these things in the real world? Because if you're just waiting for the threats to come to you, if you're just waiting for something to break that's very reactive, is there a way to be proactive and on top of this and reduce that anxiety over time or know when it's a good time to make these switches?
I think you have to make it a priority, right? Things you don't do very often, you're not going to be good at. And if you say our upgrade policy is we're going to upgrade once every 2 years on Memorial Day, and the entire team is going to come in over the weekend and work, what you're saying is this is a really big bang event. We're going to bring in pizza, we're going to bring in donuts, we're going to bring in mocktails. We're going to make a thing of this, but this is an extraordinary circumstance, an extraordinary event. I think what you're saying in that sense is we are not going to get good at doing this. Whereas if you said, all right, every month we're going to take a service and say, if it's more than 6 months since we made an update to it, we are going to test out upgrading its dependencies and redeploying it. We're going to test migrating it to a new system. That's going to be painful. That's going to be awkward at first. But anything you do in a repeated fashion like that, a consistent fashion, you're showing me you value doing that. And you're going to lessen the effect and the cost of making these migrations, making these changes, making these updates because you have to. You're forcing yourself to do it. I think one of the reasons people don't upgrade their systems is because they're worried it's going to be expensive. They don't know the scope of it, they don't know the difficulty of it. And those unknowns weigh heavily to say, I don't know what benefit I'm going to get from this. I don't pay for it. These other things I could be doing, I know how to estimate the effort that I know how to estimate the payoff from that. But what we're
All right.
looking at here, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we see that model with stuff we actually use on a daily basis.
Right.
What you think back to, oh, it used to be I would buy a new computer with a new operating system every couple of years, and that's how I wouldn't actually upgrade. I just switch my system now. But now our cell phones, our watches, anything that's digital, oh, it's time to update. Oh, can I update tonight for you? Like it makes that part of the practice instead of waiting for there to be a vulnerability that reacts to. Often they're a little bit ahead of it, or they're patching something that could have later turned into a critical vulnerability just
Right.
because, oh, every couple of days we're going to send out an update. It's not going to be a big thing. We're going to make these incremental changes we know we should be making, make them on a regular basis. Make that an acceptable part of the practice. Like, I don't think we even think about those updates. We just see it, go, okay, I acknowledge that. Versus in practice, when you're working on a big piece of technology, often you assume it's going to, oh yeah, this will be good for a little while. You mentioned once a year doing an update. And it feels like the need to do those updates is accelerating unless you're ignoring them, in which case, oh, you're just
Right.
making the problem worse.
Right. We're not getting a big envelope full of floppy disks in the mail now. We can do over the air upgrades for a lot of our systems. I know a lot of people listening to this have air gap environments and they don't have quite that easy path, but this is still something I think you can plan for and execute on. And I think anything you want to make a repeatable, scalable process, you can do that. And you can understand the costs and the benefits of doing this. You're going to have to get good at this if you're going to do this on a regular basis. And I think that's the only way to get yourself out of this situation is to make this a capacity of your system. Think about we are always going to be migrating our systems, and that may be shutting down old systems we don't need. It had a start date, it has a maintenance date, it has an end date. It's going to be replaced with something new. It could be just routine maintenance on a system. I remember at one point, this is way back when, the consultant and I said, we're going to have to reboot this old Windows MT box we have in the corner because we can maintain this, we can monitor it, we can bring it back up. If it fails over a long weekend, we're not available. This entire department is going to struggle while it's not there. We're choosing to take on this potentially difficult task now because we've made the resources and the time to address any problems we have and deliberately fix them rather than being under a really hard deadline to fix them when some external factor came in at the least convenient time.
Awesome. So I think we're coming down to is it's not one reason or the other. It's if you don't have a plan to keep up to date, you're going to fall behind, and one of these things will make the choice for you. Is that kind of a decent summation?
Well, Evan, I appreciate the chat. Always good to talk to you. I think there's more to say on this, but let's leave it here for now.
Sounds good. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with me here, Shane. Hope everyone enjoyed that. And thanks for listening to the Active State podcast. There'll be many more episodes coming down the line here in the near future.